everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Nancy Wang, and I'm the Executive Director of Voters Not Politicians. We are a grassroots group that formed in 2017 and helped lead the ballot campaign to pass a constitutional amendment to end gerrymandering in 2018. We are still supporting fair redistricting in Michigan, and right now we're also trying to think, like many are as well, trying to think how we protect our elections and our voters in the time of COVID. And I'm really honored to be joined today by this distinguished panel of guests. We have seen vote at home and absentee voting be featured a lot in the news, both nationally and in Michigan. And we have Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who's joining us today, as well as Myrna Perez from the Brennan Center, Amber McReynolds from the Vote at Home Institute and Coalition, and Paul Smith from the Campaign Legal Center. And we're excited to be having this conversation where we can talk more in detail about, what vote at home really means and what it means specifically for Michiganders and what we can expect as voters this August and this November. So first, joining us, as I said, is Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who, as our state's Chief Elections Officer, can provide us with all the information we need to understand what our options are this year and how to go about safely voting. Jocelyn?
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for hosting this. Thanks for knowing my name. And all the work that you all have done to collectively in this group to advance the best principles of our democracy throughout our country and here in Michigan. My office serves, as you all know, as the Chief Election Office for the state of Michigan. And so in that capacity, we are charged with implementing both of the initiatives that were enacted by voters overwhelmingly in 2018, both amending our Constitution to create a Citizens Redistricting Commission. And for more information about that, you can go to redistrictingmichigan.org. But then also, secondly, implementing the constitutional requirements under the proposal that, among other things, instituted voting from home in Michigan as a right that every citizen has. The Promote the Vote Amendment, as it's known, also improved our access to voter registration for our citizens, enabling citizens to register to vote in person on election day and also automatically be registered to vote if they're eligible to be registered when they interact with our office for a license or an ID. In addition to that, we've also implemented online voter registration in our state of Michigan. And so really 2020 is a new day for democracy in our state on so many levels. But it all starts from the position, as far as I'm concerned, is what's best for voters. And how do we develop a voter-centric way of administering our democracy, implementing these and other policies to ensure that we're doing what's best for voters, meeting them where they are, and listening to them about how they want their democracy to work, because that's ultimately the role of government officials in our service to the voters who elected us. So that said, we have had the benefit now of having 5 elections under this new five dress rehearsals, as you could say, even for, in preparation for the big elections this August and November. Of course, every election is big, but the August and certainly the November election will be much higher profile. But in the 5 elections we've held so far, since I took office in 2019, 4 of those were local, and 2 of them were held this year, one statewide, one local, under the specter of the coronavirus pandemic. And what we've learned from all of them are a number of things. I'll break it down into 3 categories. First is voter registration. Citizens can now register to vote up to and on election day, as I mentioned, and many other reforms as well. We've seen young citizens take advantage of these new provisions at proportions far greater than any other portion of our electorate. It's been incredible. For example, in our first election under these new rules in May of 2019, just about 10% of our state had elections in May of 2019, local elections throughout the state. And even though they were elections that usually have about 10% turnout, 400 eligible citizens registered and voted on that first election day. Of those 400, and to me that, 400, those are 400 people who are eligible to vote in our state. And previous to 2019 would not have been able to do so because they weren't registered on election day. This new provision enabled them to do that. Of those 400, over 300 were 18 or 19 years old. So an extraordinary proportion taking advantage of these election day options. And we saw those same proportions hold for every election held since. Even in our March 10th primary, to the extent that there were any crowds or lines for our elections, it was in 5 communities throughout our state only, where particularly student communities were registering to vote on election day for that presidential primary. So we've seen an extraordinary increase in registration rates, particularly among young voters as a result of these changes. And we're continuing to prepare for August and November, ensuring that even in the midst of the pandemic, citizens know that they can choose on election day to participate, registering, requesting their ballot, and returning it. And in fact, we also were able to essentially pilot that out. What does this look like in a pandemic? In our May 5th local elections that we held just a few weeks ago. Again, about 10% of our state voted. And we saw that in that moment where leading up to the election, we mailed every registered voter in a jurisdiction with an election an application to request their ballot to vote from home. 99% of citizens participating on that May 5th election chose to exercise their right to vote from home. And it was an extraordinary number. Our clerks were ready for that influx of ballots, but certainly something that was a significant endorsement of the fact that even in the height of a pandemic, as we were in that time, citizens want to still vote. They want their voices to be heard, and they will embrace and utilize their right to vote by mail if they know how to do so. And then the last thing I'll just mention is with regards to preparing for August and November, and a third piece, which is that we are implementing statewide audits of our voting systems, risk limiting audits that will be in place throughout this year. We're implementing our first statewide risk limiting audit right now in 80 of our 83 counties for our March 10th in relation to our March 10th presidential primary. So we'll have that audit in place for this fall as well, all of which will combine to make Michigan's presidential elections this year more accessible and secure than ever before, but not without its controversy. As you saw, of course, this week, Michigan's heightened state of scrutiny that we're under because of the critical role we'll play in the presidential election will mean that our voters will be inundated with just as they were this week, misinformation about their rights and what these new rights in particular mean for them. And so our office is working to really hone in on providing certainty in this time, ensuring citizens know that they have a right to vote, that our elections will continue, they have a right to vote by mail, our elections will be on schedule. In addition to that, working to communicate to citizens that even if they decide to vote on election day, and even if they decide to register and vote on election day, no matter what happens with the pandemic, we will still preserve that in-person option as well in August and November. So it is costing more money, it is taking more time, and it's creating a lot of work for our clerks more than ever before. But I'm confident that at the end of the day, we'll have a better system of democracy that's more voter-centric. And my hope is that Michigan can demonstrate to the country exactly how, even in moments like this, democracy can continue and can be preserved and can be really truly accessible and secure for all.
Secretary Benson, and thank you so much for your leadership in doing all of these things and adapting so quickly in the face of the COVID pandemic. I know that our volunteers are very thankful for you taking the steps necessary to the proactive steps to help voters vote from the safety of their homes. And I was we were very excited to see your announcement yesterday that you'll be sending applications for absentee ballots to every voter for August and November. So yes. Thank you for that. I know that you have another event after this, but I was wondering if we could ask you a question. We have 6,000 volunteers, again, who are very, very interested in this issue and excited to learn more. And I had one question that one of our volunteers was excited to pose to you, and it has to do more with the mechanics of how the absentee voting works, and specifically the signature verification. So their question was, how will voters be notified if there's a problem with their absentee ballot, so that they can correct the situation in time to have their vote count? Do you mind just speaking to that for a few minutes?
Yeah, certainly we want to ensure that every validly cast ballot and vote is counted. And we need our citizens to sign, who choose to vote by mail, to sign the outside of the envelope in which the ballot is returned. And those signatures are then matched with the signature on file through the voter registration or application form. So that said, if there's a signature mismatch, we encourage the clerks to proactively reach out to the voter to try to confirm their identity and give them an opportunity to cure the signature. We, for the first time, have created statewide standards for clerks to follow in evaluating signatures to ensure continuity and consistency across the state. And we're also working with the legislature to hopefully require clerks to do this proactive outreach. Right now, many of them do it. The vast majority of them do it, essentially, especially now more than ever before, with more people registered voting from home. But we also are encouraging our voters to stay on top of it as well through providing a ballot tracking mechanism that will help citizens track when their ballots have been sent to them, when they've been returned, and when they've been counted, so that they also can inform themselves or confirm that their ballot has been counted or it has not been counted. And if it's not been counted, they can contact their clerk to fix it. So more to come on that, and certainly more details. That, in addition to getting citizens our ballots and helping them return them on time, is a top priority of my office, to ensure that once those ballots are returned, they're counted accurately and we have low spoilage rates in our state.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much again for your time. I'm hoping that this is just the first of many conversations we'll have. I know that there's a lot of demands on your.
Ongoing. We've been having for years, and here, now we are 5 months out of November. So yeah, it's a team effort, all of us working together to ensure all voices are heard and all votes are counted. And there will be many more weeks like this one that we've all endured in the weeks ahead. But we're ready. I know you all are ready, and so it's all hands on deck. And I'm confident that we'll be doing everything we can to have smooth elections in Michigan and throughout the country this year. So thanks.
Great, thank you. She is the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute and Coalition, and they are a national nonpartisan center that really designs pro-voter policies and advises states on them. And she is also a member of Secretary Benson's Election Modernization Advisory Committee. So I'm really excited to have you here, Amber, because you have such a unique perspective, I think, from both the national level about vote at home and all the best practices we're seeing across the states, and why, and insight into what states are kind of wrestling with as they move to vote at home, and then also what vote at home and us moving more to allow people to vote at home or enable them to, what that looks like in Michigan specifically. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is exciting, and just always great to see Secretary Benson, who's, I think, doing such an incredible job for Michigan. So
great. So I'd like to just dive in and see, what is vote at home? Why do you know it is better policy-wise for states to go in that direction? And then if you could speak to some issues that I think people have concerns about, security and safety of our elections and turnout, that would be great.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, our organization is a nonprofit, and we've been working on voting at home policies and vote by mail related policies for the last couple of years. We've been a leading national organization and voice on this particular topic. I myself am a former elections official, so that also makes me a little bit unique in this process. And I ran elections for 14 years in Denver, and during my time as director helped to rewrite the Colorado election laws on voting by mail and create a whole new voter model that really put voters first. And the model that we developed in Colorado has become a national model, and it's one that a lot of other states are following. We perfected many of these procedures and best practices and developed a lot of new technologies in the process while we were implementing this that have improved this process overall across many states. So I come at this sort of as a former election official, and then also now as someone who's leading this national effort. And we've done a couple of things in our institute to number one, help policymakers think about reforms around this issue, but number two, help states implement this policy and make sure the procedures are right and in place, and make sure states and localities have best practices that they can utilize. So we're directly working with states and local election officials across the country, including Michigan, to make sure that they do have what they need to implement an inevitable increase. Because what I've also been sharing with many people as we talk about this issue is it's not up to politicians to decide if you vote at home. It's not up to policymakers. It's not up to advocacy organizations or even election officials. It's up to each individual voter, because they have the choice to decide. And we're seeing an inevitable increase in voters opting themselves in to choose this method of voting. And so we have to make sure that election officials are ready for that increase in volume that is inevitable. It's voters' choice to do it, and we're seeing that increase happen across the country. So we have to make sure everybody's prepared to handle that volume increase, modify procedures, make sure the best practices are in place. And our organization is uniquely positioned to help in that arena because of our experience and our expertise on these topics. A couple of the sort of usually headlining issues with this reform include security and safety. And what we have been saying, and what our entire goal here is to make sure that every single voter can access the process in a safe, secure, accessible, and also equitable way. And voting at home is very much about that. It's about all of those principles combined to create an improved voting experience for every elector. And the security and safety aspects of the system are really important. And the thing that is critical is that this is both old and new. It's both. It's a reform that's been utilized for a long period of time across the board. And oh, am I frozen? Okay, just on my screen. So it's both old and new, and we've had voters voting by mail all the way back to the Civil War with military voters that utilized it. So it's been in place for a long period of time, and now it's just going to be used by more and more voters because of the pandemic and because of the conditions that have changed state by state. And so we just need to make sure that the procedures are in place. And Secretary Benson mentioned the signature verification process. There's other aspects of this that ensure security, including ballot tracking systems, as we're going to see implemented in Michigan. That type of technology was created actually all the way back in 2009 in Denver. We created the first version of that, and now it's being utilized in various states, including large states like California, that have implemented that. And that basically allows a voter to track their mail ballot just like you would a package. And you get that information, you get that transparency and accountability to know where your ballot is at every moment in time. And those are the sorts of tools and procedures and processes that we can implement to make sure the system is secure and that voters are protected. The second kind of big thing that comes up all the time, and I get asked about this, is voting fraud. And while it's exceedingly rare, it's understandable when people have concerns about this, because it's our democracy and we need to make sure it's secure. And so what, including security measures like what we just talked about, but also making sure that we're very clear about voting fraud versus election fraud is really important. And a lot of times those two things get mixed together and they're just not the same. Voting fraud is extremely rare. It's extremely rare that a voter would do something on their own to interfere with the process. But what's more frequent is election fraud, meaning voters, there's attempts to interfere with the voters' process, attempts to discard ballots like what we saw in North Carolina in 2018, or other interference or intimidation even that can happen at in-person voting locations, or voters being told to go to the wrong locations. Those are all things that interfere with the voting process and in essence are fraud and also create barriers to voters having that safe and secure process. So we need to guard against all of those sorts of things and make sure we are able to detect, deter, and then hold bad actors accountable that attempt to hurt voters' ability to vote. And that's a really important aspect of not just the vote at home system, but also all parts of the election system that voters engage with. So thanks. I'm really happy to be here and happy to answer questions and look forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you. And I think that's a great viewpoint, right? To look at all of this, the entire system as being there to serve voters, to make sure that the voter is able to cast the ballot in the way that they choose. And here in Michigan, us having the constitutional right to vote by mail, having the systems in place so that our votes are counted, so that we have the assurance that, they will be counted. But then also having the information we need in order to exercise our franchise, and having different options of how we return the ballot, all to make the process a lot more convenient, and obviously in the age of COVID, health protective as well. So I thank you for your role in helping us in this state, put those measures in place so that we can encourage as many voters as possible, to cast their vote despite the health pandemic we have right now. And speaking of questions, we do have one from a VNP volunteer. And they'd like to talk about, we've seen a lot of the rhetoric recently about how vote by mail, favors one party or favors another, almost discouraging states from adopting it for partisan reasons. Who's right on which side, right? Does vote by mail really benefit Democrats more than Republicans, or vice versa? What have you seen both in your experience and your study across the nation?
It doesn't benefit one side or the other, and there's been a lot of research reports put out on this topic. And we've seen this reform implemented in blue states, red states, purple states, and we've seen it effectively implemented in all of those situations. And so, and we're seeing secretaries across the country of both parties implement exactly what Secretary Benson announced this week with mailing out applications to every voter. We saw the Georgia Secretary of State do the same thing, as well as Iowa. And I really commend these secretaries for taking up and making sure their voters know exactly what their options are to vote in a safe and secure way. And so it is a nonpartisan issue, helping voters make sure they know about their options, and then making sure that the voting experience is a good one and that voters are served effectively in the process and don't have to wait 6 hours in line is not a partisan issue. It's an American issue, and it's one that is about serving all electors. And that's what election officials and the chief election officials in states are trying to do across the country. And it's unfortunate when we sort of hear the partisan rhetoric that gets introduced into this process, because ultimately it's about voters, it's about serving them, and it's about making sure that the process is safe and secure for every single voter that engages in the voting process.
Great. Well, that's good to know that the data is there to kind of debunk that myth, right? Because, it strikes us as voters, not politicians, that the safe voting discussion, really has so many parallels to redistricting, where a lot of people were trying to politicize, make it, it was such a partisan hot button issue. But what we saw here in Michigan with the vote on our ballot initiative was that, fair maps was supported across party lines all throughout the state. And I see that the same is true for absentee voting. The research shows that in Michigan, for example, there's 72% across the electorate in favor for it. So I'm hoping that, people will kind of see that this is, about their right to vote, and they take advantage regardless of, party affiliation. So that's great.
I always say that this is really about who votes, not who wins. And we have to make the process work for the electorate, and that's the most important priority, is to make this accessible and safe and secure for every single voter.
to ask Mirna Perez for some of your insights as to the other aspects of vote by mail, right? So I know that there's a lot of discussion, rightfully, about how to get your absentee ballot, what happens to the ballot after you've completed it. But Mirna, I know that you've spent a lot of time, studying and advocating for all of the other parts of the system that you need to make sure that no voter is disenfranchised by a vote at home, predominantly vote at home system. So do you mind speaking a little bit more to that, about the safeguards that we would need both, in Michigan, and just kind of general as, policy prescription that you have for states, to make sure that every voter is able to still exercise their right to vote?
Program at the Brennan Center. I am thrilled to be with my good friends Amber and Paul. We have been in the trenches together for a lot longer than I'd like to admit, but the mirror doesn't lie. So I'm a civil rights lawyer, and so I see the world in terms of one of inclusion and in terms of racial justice. And I have been asked to talk about two things: the idea of legitimacy behind an election system and how we leave no voter behind. And I know that that VNP also shares those two values. So in terms of legitimacy, we need to remember that about 100 million people did not vote in our last election. If they were polled by the Knight Foundation to try and get a sense of why, and their responses were things like, don't like it, doesn't matter, I'm not interested, the system is corrupt, I don't know the issues. And these are all things that can change. These are all things that we should be committed to changing. I know VNP are change makers, and this is not something that we should accept as static, but as a challenge and something that we need to put our resources behind to change. We need to make people believe that they have some power to be able to influence the people that are making very important decisions about incredibly intimate aspects of their life. And we need to have a democracy where people see themselves reflected in it. And that means seeing gaps, right? That means seeing where traditional systems leave people behind. That means looking at who is not going to be courted or paid attention to when you have politicians and campaigns focusing on volume, focusing on numbers that they think will lead to a particular outcome. We need to bring more people into the system. And in order to do that, we believe that polling places must be a critical option for people during this time period. We're in the middle of a pandemic, so we are completely with Amber that every eligible American should have access to a vote by mail system right now. But we need to protect our polling places. We need to not switch to vote by mail on the backs of people who need polling places. And there's a number of reasons why, forget about the Mirna bleeding heart, level. There's a lot of very practical reasons why that's the case. The first is that polling locations need to be a fail-safe and a backup. As Amber has noted, there are some states that have really got vote by mail down, but there are a lot of states that are going to be ramping up way faster than anybody thinks is ideal. And there's going to be slippage. There's going to be things that go wrong. There's going to be ballots that don't get processed, voter error, like the secretary said about people not filling out the ballot correctly. We know that sometimes voters think that they have actually voted when they've just simply applied for a mail ballot. We know that right now that our election administrators don't have the funding that they need to be able to process the vast amount of vote by mail increases that were expected. And polling places need to be a meaningful backup for all of the glitches that are going to happen when we have to make the change that we're making at the rate that we're making. So that is just a practical risk diversification standpoint. The second is that we cannot forget that vote by mail is not an essential part of how many people experience democracy. If you live on a Native American reservation, you do not trust the mail, because the way you experience your addresses, the way your tribe thinks about your addresses is not going to be lockstep with the way the post office considers your addresses. If you live in a really urban area, if you live in a really rural area, you could have very, very spotty mail system, especially now that we see the mail and the post office being under attack. We cannot build our election infrastructure on the basis of something that is constantly at the source of a political firestorm, and even in the best of circumstances doesn't serve everybody. Because if there are communities that already get really bad mail, and if we tell them that the way they change their circumstances, the way they influence the way the power structure impacts them is by reinforcing and depending upon a symptom of their of the way that they have knocked out, is just going to be baking in an inequity and an inequality that we cannot tolerate. And then finally, I would note that there are a lot of services that, as of now, happen best at polling locations. Right now, Michigan has election day registration. That has to happen at a polling place right now, or something of the equivalent of a polling place at your county center. For people that weren't engaged, people that we missed, people that the system failed by not bringing them earlier, they need to have that option. If you are a person that has visual or physical impairments and handling a ballot or reading what the ballot says in terms of paper copy, you're going to need the kind of technology that happens right now at polling places, so that you can vote an independent and autonomous ballot. If you are a person that needs translation services, and you don't want to depend upon your husband or someone else in your family, and you want to be able to get it from work, or you need to be able to go in and get those kinds of services. So, we're in the middle of a crisis, and I always tell people that when life is as hard as it is right now for Americans, we need more options, not fewer. And we need to make sure that by expanding access to the vote by mail system, that we don't sacrifice a system that we know people depend upon and people use. The Brennan Center just did an analysis of Georgia, and it's on our website. It just came out. It's just one state, and it's really early. But there is a unmistakable racial disparity in who has already requested mail ballots and who in the past voted in person but is now choosing to vote mail. The idea of voting in person is a civic and to some extent a religious act for some people, especially communities that have had to fight and die for the right to vote. This was their way of resistance. This was their way of demonstrating power. This was the way of showing to people who would intimidate and suppress them that they belong here and that they're Americans. And that is not something that we can expect to reasonably overcome, in one election cycle. And because that is the case, we need to make sure that in the course of trying to give voter options, we don't leave these voters out in the cold. And so I hope that we will have your support and your help in making sure that there are not unreasonable reductions in terms of polling places, even as people start to consider vote by mail. After a number of years, when we start seeing the education stick in and people start actually shifting behavior, and there are things that we can see about what interventions change people behavior, then maybe we can start talking about that. But this is not the time to be sacrificing polling locations. Now, the last thing I want to leave with you guys is how do we bring people into the system? They're, super excited about automatic voter registration, really excited about online registration. We've got two big problems right now. People can't go into DMVs right now and get registered automatically because the DMVs are shuttered. With respect to things like online registration, that doesn't help us if the digital divide is real. And that is exactly where an organization like BNP comes in. We need to not be relying on the slick, tech-based, social media only way of turning out voters. We need to go old school if we're actually going to get people in. That means phone trees at churches. That means old-fashioned mail. That means adopting a member of your parish or a family friend who would be intimidated about filling an application by themselves. The digital divide is real. And because of the way incentive structures are for campaigns, folks that are easily engaged by things like texts and social media pushes and email pushes, they're very likely to be fine under any circumstances. Like, it's the people that we actually need to get in deep and need to engage multiple times and need to tell your vote matters. The system will represent you. You cannot be thinking that that you don't know enough, or that your viewpoint doesn't matter, or you're not expert enough. We need all of you. We need people to invest that time. And I think your organization, with the grassroots component of it, the way that you just went voter to voter to try and persuade them for some of the incredible reforms that we had, makes you very, very well suited to do that. So I hope when you're thinking about massive numbers, you don't forget the untold hundreds of millions of people in this country that nobody's actually trying to engage, and people have given up, because that is where I think that you guys would have a unique value add.
Thank you so much, Mirna. I really appreciate that. We're looking at this as us, acting in several different fronts at the same time, right? And I appreciate you kind of reminding us that this is not a simple issue. As you know, Voters Not Politicians, we're advocating for everyone to be mailed a ballot, not just an application. And we are agitating for, we're engaging our volunteers to call their legislators, because we need legislative action to do that. But at the same time, we are advocating for policies to keep our in-person options open, and in fact to expand clerk hours in the lead up to Election Day, so that people can vote on nights and weekends and kind of have that spacing. But then as an educational lift also is just, to have our volunteers engaged in spreading the message. On the one hand, that, for them to have faith in the system, even as we are trying to encourage as many people to vote by mail, that this doesn't exclude you from the process. We're not, trying to exclude you, but actually to bring you still into the process by allowing these different options for people to participate. And then, as you said, also to reach out to people that haven't been part of, taking part in elections, and trying to bring more people in. And I think we are really excited, and we have a statewide network who, that loves to pick up the phone and loves to, write postcards and letters and all that. And we definitely are going to be taking a role in a statewide education and, encouraging people to take part in this election. So I'm really excited to hopefully to continue to work with you and the Brennan Center to think of, ways to have a very sophisticated program, so that we make sure that we get all the elements that we need to get everyone to be able to vote this year. So thank you. And last but not least,
what question is mine? Well, what question is mine? I didn't get a question.
Oh yeah,
Nobody's got a question for me.
Sorry, I think we've answered some of this, I think, already. But the question was, does vote by mail lead to more voter fraud? And I think the consensus really is the data, says no. But I think that really goes to people, for whatever reason, trying to to make real people doubt, or have less confidence in a vote by mail system. And I'd love to hear your perspective of how do we message, right, to people in light of COVID, to say, no, this is a time to engage, right? It's not time to, to doubt if the system's working correctly, for you to be discouraged from voting. That's going to be a challenge for us.
Well, the way you counter misinformation and active disinformation is by saturating truth, right? That's way. So we have to remember that, Paul and I sue discriminators all the time, and I can tell you, I think many of them know that this fraud thing is not truthful, but they say it because they win. I mean, the 100 million people that I spoke to said they don't like the candidates, they're not interested, the system is corrupt, so even it doesn't have to be true, provided that it makes people think like, ugh, this is like a political mess and life is too hard and I don't want to deal with it. So what we need to do is instead show the value and power of participating. We need to lift up positive stories. We need to talk about the kind of pride that happens when people go to the polling places with their kids. We need to have like a positive message about voting, and we also need to be careful when we're talking about the voter suppression aspect of it, to not to be buying into their frame so much. I mean, you'll see very close to an election, I am very much, I got this. Like, I am, a really good lawyer and I have your back. And if someone's trying to suppress your vote, go to the ballot anyway. Somebody will be there to help you. We will cover you. Do not let these bad guys win, because that's what they want. And I think we just need to remember to not pile on the, you have to go because you're under siege, but instead, go because it's the right thing to do. Go because it's the way you demonstrate how much you care about your community. You need to go and vote because that's the way we resolve our political differences. One of the things I think you guys could work on with the legislature is get more than just your county doing election day registration, right? Like, wouldn't it be wonderful if you guys got all those polling places you preserve to be offering EDR opportunities? I mean, you need to have something to be for, because otherwise you'll just keep yourself from moving backwards at that. And so I think that's the way we deal with this fraud, being like, here's something truthful that you can get behind.
Superb, thank you. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Paul Smith from Campaign Legal Center, who, as it happens, is also lead counsel in our federal cases, where we are fending off attacks by the Michigan Republican Party and Michigan Freedom Fund to undo the constitutional amendment that we passed to end gerrymandering. So, Paul, we really appreciate your help on so many fronts. You've been a supportive ally, and we are grateful. And I'm really interested in hearing from you about vote by mail and moving to true vote by mail. So, as I mentioned, we are at the stage where, because of Proposal 3 passing in 2018, every Michigander now has the constitutional right to request an absentee ballot and to vote by mail. But we at Voters Not Politicians really felt, having seen the lines and the crowding and frankly, I think at 50 or more people being put, at direct risk and contracting COVID because of these lines, that, and given the trends and the examples that states across the country have shown in the fact that they have been able to implement a full vote by mail system, that this really is the best policy solution for Michigan to mail ballots to voters, for 2020 as well as beyond. And I'd like to hear from you what that looks like, and to hear your thoughts on, what are the advantages of a true vote by mail system in the long run. As I said before, it looks like 3/4 of Michiganders are in support of that movement.
Thank you, Nancy. And let me start by saying how happy and proud we are to be working with you and VNP, defending the redistricting commission that you fought so hard to create. And also, just as a matter of say, Michigan already should be proud of the kind of progress that you've made in terms of making the election system work. With the kinds of options that Miriam talked about, with early as well as mail voting, no excuse required to vote by mail, a signature match system to verify the ballots, which has plenty of safeguards in it, and it makes it easy for the voter to find out if their ballot's been disqualified and fix that problem and make sure they get to vote. I love the idea of the tracking system, just like you get on Amazon. These are all good things, and you should understand that there's so many states out there that we're suing as that are so far behind. You have to have an excuse to vote by mail, and the COVID doesn't count. The states that say that disqualify ballots for not having supposedly not having signatures, but don't even tell the voter that it's been nullified. So with all that, I then want to say, look, you've come so far. Why not come a little farther? Why not do what the president accused Michigan of just yesterday and mail out not just the applications, but make the ballot something that everybody has and can simply fill out and drop off or mail back. And I say that that's an improvement, and I think VNP is right to be advocating it, because you think about what the process is like when you have to mail an application, it has to get mailed back, you then have to mail your ballot. You get mailed your ballot and then mail it back. It's essentially 4 transactions with the post office in many cases, with all of the possibilities of error that occur with that. And you're going to get less participation. And the one thing that we know about democracy, it's better the more people who vote. And we in this country, with people not voting as much as they should, other states are attacking that problem. California and New Jersey are recent examples by distributing the ballots, by making them available to people so that they can very easily fill them out and return them. And if it would be a better system, and the concerns about fraud that get raised in this are just old canards. They really are just ways in which people make excuses for designing the system so fewer people vote. And I've been fighting the voter ID laws for years. Again, a thing that is designed to suppress the vote, but supposedly deters fraud that doesn't exist. And if we got to this ultimate stage of making it as easy as possible for people to vote, particularly in a year when most people are going to want to vote without going into a polling place, then you wouldn't see some upsurge in fraud. People have no incentive to engage in voter fraud. It's just not the way the system works, and the experience of other states who have done this kind of system makes that clear. And so this would be the final straw, making the system even better. But you should understand it's pretty good now, and you should be proud of yourselves in Michigan for what you've accomplished. Better than it was just a few short years ago, thanks to the work of a lot of good people who care about democracy. So I think I'll pause there, Nancy, since we're probably running a little short on time.
Right.
Let's see if I've answered that question.
I have a question for you, and this comes from one of our super volunteers, Rena Bosch, who happens to be also a township clerk. And her question is, mailing every voter a ballot in light of the pandemic might be the best solution, but it's also a unique one. A situation, and isn't necessarily the best permanent solution. I'll put that to you, Paul, first, and then I invite.
Well, I think that's a.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, my would be that's really a matter of choice. There are states that have gone in that route and have found that to be a really workable system. It is definitely something the voters like. And have grown to support in states where it's being used, like Oregon, now California and others. But this year obviously would particularly desirable. But other states have a slightly different approach and say, no, we would rather stick with a somewhat more traditional absentee ballot system. Most people are going to want to vote in person anyway. I think that the trend is to go in the direction of just mailing ballots to everybody and letting people vote by mail, and that's probably where we're going to be in future years. But for God's sake, do it this year if you can.
Amber, Myrna, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure. Well, I can speak to what our approach was in Colorado. I mean, we revolutionized what voting looks like, and what I mean by that is we decided to put voters first. We wanted to streamline the process, make it easier for them so they didn't have to try to work through and navigate the confusing application process and remember to do all of that each time. And then we also wanted to expand their options for in-person voting, because the traditional method of assigning you to a polling place and only giving you one option on election day is problematic for a lot of voters, especially those that work away from their homes, or maybe have kids that they have to pick up from school and can't stand in line for a few hours at night with their kids. So what we tried to do is create the voting at home system of mailing ballots to everyone, but then preserving in-person options with same-day registration at vote centers, and that was created in Colorado, innovated there. Now it's being rolled out in California. So we've solved a lot of these issues that voters have across the country when they vote. And if you look over the headlines in 2018, 6-hour lines in New York City, 4-hour lines in Georgia during early voting. The lines happen every single cycle, and voters get left out because of that process every single cycle. And so the current way of doing things, frankly, doesn't work for a vast majority of people that don't vote or try to vote. And we know that because even if you look at data that looked at 2016 and 2018 and asked non-voters why they didn't participate, close to 40% cited inconvenience as the reason. Not that they didn't want to, not that they didn't try. It just cited inconvenience as a problem. And so voting at home is a proven solution to address that. And I think that we're going to see more and more states adopt what works well and what's worked in various Western states over a long period of time.
Great, thanks. And Mirna?
And then I would just say I'm mostly with Paul in that I think this is largely a political question, and the decision about what to do goes forward depends on like what it costs to achieve that result and the opportunity cost of what you could have been advocating for instead. But what I will say is that there will be excellent data and learning from this experience. I do think that there will be states that will see that the republic did not collapse when more people voted by mail. And so they can be now more open to it. And they're going to have data pushed back against some of the lies that we're hearing that are very opportunistic, that aren't based in reality. And so I think, as Paul said, if we need to sell this politically, that this is the time now to meet the moment that we're in, great. But we are going to know something about what is called for in the future. And elections should be dynamic. They should be responsive to data. They should be changing as societal inputs and voter preferences and American lives change. And I think we just need to remember that the entirety of our lives have been disrupted because of this pandemic. The way we run elections is not exempt from that. It's not like our schools are closed, the way we go to restaurants, everything in the world has to change. It is out of step and unrealistic to assume that the one thing that is probably the most important thing of our civil society can somehow be in a bubble and not change too. And so I think to get through the next 6 months, we need to be politically savvy and politically smart. But then we need to look at what we learned and what we know and move forward there. And then every few years, we need to reassess and figure out if there's a way we can do it better. So I'm really excited about the opportunities that we are seeing to experiment, and to learn and to change. And my hope is that, especially with people like Amber and Paul, and VNP working at it, the voters are going to be better off. We're gonna keep improving this democracy experiment of ours, and I'm really grateful that VNP is part of it.
Thank you. As Paul was saying, there were so many reforms, really dramatic reforms that passed in Michigan in 2018, and they were voter led. In our case, it was volunteer led, and what really got people united around this idea was that it was something to fight for, right? This was like pro-voter. We wanted fair maps. We wanted our voices to count. And to me, this issue, we're seeing the same kind of excitement around it. We're seeing the same kind of dedication and mobilization of people around expanded voting and safe voting right now in the age of COVID, because it is so, there's such an immediate kind of health threat, but in the long run too, just kind of better pro-voter policies. Our volunteers and citizens across Michigan are really demanding that now. So you're right. Unfortunately, we are running short of time. So I will put a plug in here to say, Voters Not Politicians, we are fighting to make it as convenient as possible and as safe as possible for voters to vote this August and November. And for that, we're fighting to get a ballot in every voter's mailbox. To do that, we need a legislature to act, right? We need them to authorize the Secretary of State to send ballots. We also need them to pass legislation to make it, give clerks the power and the flexibility to process this wave, this increase in absentee ballots that that we're expecting. And we also need the funding, infrastructure, and support for our clerks to provide expanded hours on nights and weekends leading up to Election Day, to provide in-person, more in-person options to people this year. So we really call on people, if you're not already involved in Voters Not Politicians, please go online or call us to volunteer so that we can get Michigan the pro-voter legislature we need to enact these policies so that we can exercise our constitutional right to vote and to vote safely. So again, I'll thank our distinguished panelists for this conversation today. I can't believe I'm seeing myself on the same screen as all of you. You like the fact that you are just nonpartisan pro-voter champions, national experts. I'm really honored to have shared this space and been able to discuss these really, really important issues with all of you all. So thank you so much for your time and for your willingness to engage with us.
Thank you.
Great, and thank you all. Thank you all for joining us, and we will talk soon. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.